Hello, everyone. It's good to be with you again. For those who don't know me, I'm a retired professor. I've taught various things, but primarily a physician, biochemist, nutrition orientated, until students got on my case and moved me from that area to an area of my life which was, I believed the Christian story was true, but I didn't live it out. Students changed that. This morning, I'm going to talk about marriage a little bit, and you'll see why in just a moment. So, here we go. But, of course, before I get to that, I will do a little bit more on the Sermon on the Mount for those who request it. We've been through the Beatitudes, and if you've understood them, you know that you can expect to go through them day by day. They are, if you like, God's training program. And what they're designed to do is to allow you to live a much more fulfilled Christian life. And just in the last week or two, I came across Tom Wright's a talk he gave in New York entitled After You Believe. So just put N.T. Wright and After You Believe into YouTube and you'll get to it. It's a stunningly good talk. You won't bother listening to me after you got used to Tom Wright, but that's okay. If I introduce people to him, I'm doing a good job. So what it's all about is that we should become salt and light. People who are recognized for the fact that they care about and they are concerned to implement things that have higher goods in mind than merely immediate satisfaction of the senses. It's wisdom and love and justice. One of the things I did in this last week was read through the book of Colossians 3 or 4 times during the week. I do that every now and again when I suppose I get a little stuck and I need a little deeper. And so rereading the same passage is very good because then you start to think about it more. And then you can test yourself by taking a plain sheet of paper and writing out what you have learned in the process. And then the next step, which I haven't done with Colossians yet, is to go back and compare what you have learned and see what you've missed out. And then you start to realize, oh, dear me, I'm in trouble. I've got some work to do. One of the things that stopped me in my tracks, immediately when I got to it, Paul's writing, the end of his life, he's in prison, he knows the end is not far away, he is literally in chains, chained to a Roman soldier all the while. I can't imagine what that Roman soldier's like. I often thought of trying to write a letter purporting to come from that soldier about this man that he has to sit next to all day while he dictates these amazing prison epistles. That must have blown him out of his mind. I think he must, in due course, have become a Christian almost inevitably, but it would be a nice little thing to write. Of course, I haven't done it, but I might try. But he, as usually, he introduces himself by wishing on them grace and peace from God. But the thing that got me right at the beginning was verse 8, where he said, he prays for people, not that they may become Christian so much. That he wants, that's a given. But he prays most when he sees evidence of fruit, when he sees evidence of people's lives becoming more fulfilled and reaching out to others. I mean, the first description of what the world thought of Christians was, they said, these guys love one another. How amazing. And that's what spread the gospel. The Muslims use swords. Christians use loving one another, which we're not as good at as they were. If that love cost their lives, they didn't care a hoot. That was fine. Their belief in what was to come was so intense and so real, they couldn't be touched. We're a long way from that. You have to go to the developing world to see it on any scale. And it's still only happening in the places where they're right on the edge with opposition. But Paul, so he says, I'm really praying for you now because I hear that you're loving one another. And then he has a phrase, love in the power of the Spirit. See, we have become so navel-gazing, we can only think of something like love in affective terms. How does it make us feel? Paul couldn't care less about that because his feelings are subjugated to his mind, not the other way round. So, and his mind, he knows, is being transformed by the work of the Spirit. So he's talking about love that comes from without, within, and he knows where it comes from. Not love, me being excited sexually or whatever, but the Spirit coming and prompting me into things that I didn't think about. And we, of course, don't see the ramifications. And when you do whatever it is you're currently being pushed into doing, you may or may not see the immediate results. I had an email this week from a doctor. He just wanted to say, I heard you first 15 years ago, and I just want you to keep going, that's all. It was very brief, a very doctor note, not wasting any words, but he had no idea how good that was for me. Anybody who was not moved and did not enjoy a note like that has got something missing in their soul. And that's what Jesus wants to take you through every day, moving you step by step through the Beatitudes, with the intent that you will become salt in the world, preserving what is good, destroying what is evil, and light in the world, drawing people to the light of the world. That's the best thing that can happen in anyone's life. And, of course, all the early martyrs bore witness to that. I've no doubt at all that one of the most important events in Paul's life, while he was still Saul and a militant traditional Jew, wanted to kill these Christians. And then he witnessed the martyrdom of Stephen. And as Stephen looked up into heaven, unaware almost of the stones that were killing him, Paul knew that he had met something much bigger than he'd ever thought of before. And the best was yet to come. So reading Colossians was wonderful. It also contains, for me, one of the best metaphors for what it means to become a Christian. He says that God translated us from the kingdom of Satan into the kingdom of his dear Son. The metaphor is understood very easily, I think, in terms of the 1960s, when all the erstwhile colonies were becoming free from Britain. So at midnight there would be a formal handing over, and the British flag would be lowered and the new flag would be raised. The next morning when you woke up, you were living under a new jurisdiction. You had been translated from the kingdom of the UK, from the kingdom of Britain, to the kingdom of Kenya or Tanzania or whatever it was. You are still the same person. You're not changed by that process. What is changed by that process is your relationship to another power. That's the beginning of Christianity. I read somewhere else this week, and I can't remember at the moment where it was, some modern person saying, I was compelled to believe because I was overwhelmed by the truth of what I had discovered. An intellectual, and I can't remember who it was. C.S. Lewis said the same thing in Surprised by Joy, where he was arguing against faith, but everywhere he turned, he kept running into Christians. And then he says, one night I actually got down on my knees. And then he says, He was overwhelmed. He says, I was dragged, kicking and struggling into the kingdom. Perhaps the most unhappy man in England that night. But that was a turning point. He was to become one of the most happy men in England because of what he was allowed to do. The Sermon on the Mount is, if you like, a mechanistic view of that phenomenon. Now, the whole of the next of the 3 chapters, 5, 6, and 7, are now, in my view anyway, a development of those first dozen verses, learning how to work your way through the sequence of training, which is the Beatitudes, beginning to be salt and beginning to be light. Next, he's going to deal with legalism, which we won't touch today, but what he does is take half a dozen examples from the law, and he turns the law upside down. Astonishing. The law is not a set of rules to be kept, primarily. They are to be honoured, they are to be kept, but that's not what they're for. And I'll leave that hanging for next week. Now, to move on to what I want to talk about most, this coming weekend, I shall be at the marriage of one of my granddaughters. I get to read one of the lessons, which is Ephesians 2. What a lovely passage to have to read. And I will enjoy the whole process. Of course, every time a marriage comes along, you look back and you wonder, in the best sense, about your own marriage. I mean, no marriage is straightforward because they're all fallen creatures. In just over a year's time, we will have been married for 60 years, a long while. And if anyone had told us back then, when my faith was minuscule, Sally's was more alive at that point than mine, that we would watch from that marriage 4 natural children and a quasi-adopted one, who are all married and have given us 22 grandchildren. And now we have half a dozen great-grandchildren. And the tribe is increasing and is going to increase more again this year in terms of marriage. It's astonishing to me to watch. That's pleasure of a different level than we normally have. It's a sort of deep down wonder at what God can do. So that's going to be a lovely weekend, I'm quite sure. There'll be lots of talk and stories and the rest. I don't know what will happen other than watching the beginning of a marriage. It's almost a miracle in itself. I mean, Kalina and her husband-to-be, Noah. Noah is an Australian who came to Canada last year to go and work at a Christian camp in Muskoka, where Kalina, who's now a nurse, was taking a break, so to speak. And Noah just watched her for a few days, and then he came and said, I watched the way you care for the kids, and I really like that. That's conversation starting, and this coming weekend they're getting married. I don't think there's a better way to do it, really. There's a lot to be said for arranged marriages when the arranger is God Almighty through the Holy Spirit. But that's the beginning, isn't it? And that brings me to the second point. What do you do? What can you do to avoid the horrors of divorce? There are things you can do. The best talk on this, which I've certainly mentioned in the past, and if you go on listening to me and therefore I go on, I'll probably mention it again, probably at regular intervals, because all the best things grow better with repeating, because they become more central to the structure of your lives. And the best talk I've ever heard on the subject of how can I divorce-proof my marriage is by Janet Smith. I often have fun with what she does, because if I'm invited to talk to a liberal audience in a university, which before COVID used to be regular, hasn't quite recovered. I suppose it probably won't. This is probably the substitute. I would tease the audience in the evening, say I was giving an evening talk, and say something like this. I haven't been in your university very long, so I don't know much about you at all. But I do know one thing. I know that you all hate divorce. And, of course, that's so politically incorrect, you know. You're going to hurt the feelings of divorcees. Maybe briefly, but with a bit of divine help, maybe we'll help them. But I don't say that at the time. I say, I can see you think I should take remedial training immediately. But before I do, I think I can tell you that I know a bit more about you than you probably know yourself at one level. If you haven't had divorce in your family, your friends certainly have. Has any child ever enjoyed it? And the answer, of course, is no. And you can see it on their faces immediately. No, I said, no child has enjoyed it. I said, I have a Christian colleague that I've never met personally, but we're certainly on the same space in many issues. Her name is Janet Smith, and she's a theologian, Catholic. But for years she said to her class, I will pay you $1,000 if you keep my 4 rules and divorce. And she's never paid out, or she hadn't when I last checked. It's bound to be the odd case at some point. But and then I say, well, I'm sorry, I've got off track, which I do very easily, and I must get back onto dealing with tonight's title. And usually young women in the audience will say, please, what are the rules? Please. They haven't said anything in public, in a lecture, ever before in their lives, in many cases. But they want to know those rules. Because we are made for one another. The man needs the woman more than the woman needs the man in many ways. At least that's what Genesis teaches. It's not good for the man to be alone. For the good of the world, women are asked to civilize a man as a primary task. I mean, if every woman civilized 2 males, how much better the world would be. But that's the way round it is. Men don't do well without women in their lives. Women seem to be able to handle it much better. So, the first rule I would never have thought of. I was surprised that as soon as I'd seen it, I thought, you're right, of course. Because we are such a materialistic society. The first thing she says you must do is every year sit down together and look at how blessed you have been in the last year and look round for appropriate places to share. Become outward-looking and charitable. Easier to do in the States where you have real charitable deductions, whereas in Canada we have a charitable deduction which they then secretly take back from you so that it ends up as being peanuts. So I'll file that bit, but I don't give because of a charitable deduction in Canada. I can count. It's not worth the paper it's written on. It ought to be, because every society should be keen to make its members more charitable. And of course, when you marry, one of you will be more materialistic than the other. So one is going to civilize the other. There'll be quid pro quos in other areas. But that's a lovely thing to think of doing, some time in November every year, in the dark days of winter for us, and think about the good things that can be done. Good start. Number 2, of course, is utterly ridiculous in our modern world. No sex before marriage. But she was realistic even back then when she did this 20 years ago. You can find this talk on YouTube. One More Soul, I think, owns the copyright, but I think it's still easily available. I haven't checked. Some of you will write to me if it's not easily available and tell me where it is. But even way back years ago, it was running in the 500,000 level. So I'm sure it's still around. It's a classic. So she says, I know that many of you are having sex long before you should. And of course, the people who are the libertarians who want sexual freedom, they are milking data and adjusting it to get their own view of what the world should be like over. And so when Canada did a youth and AIDS study some years ago, they quite ridiculously made everybody who'd had one sexual commitment, one event, they would put them in sexually active. They were trying to talk, they pretended they were talking about public health. Now, they could have entirely changed the whole nature of what they proposed as policy by simply saying 1, 2, or 3 separated episodes and then no more. It's not sexually active, certainly in terms of spreading disease. But that would have left them with a very, very different story. So they told a lie. Or they told, if it wasn't a lie, if they really believed it, they were intellectually incompetent. They can take their choice, liar or incompetent. But Janet Smith understood. She said, no, if you are sleeping around and you're thinking about marriage, you would be very wise to stop sleeping together. I can't remember. I think she says for a year, it might even be 2 years, but for a significant amount of time, don't have sex together. Because if you can't love one another without sex, you're not in love. You're in sexual need. And that's not the basis for a marriage. It's wise. We don't talk about it in church. We should. I mean, it sounds so old-fashioned, doesn't it? Yet we know deep down that there's a great need for some of this kind of civility. I mean, Jane Austen is still read and reread, and the BBC lovely 6-part version is watched and rewatched time and time again. Why? It evokes a world that we know is better than the one we've produced over the last little while. More of that in a moment. The best, of course, is to marry virgins. Some of my children have done that. They have better marriages. I didn't do it. I'm envious. It's the best way to go. It's not an accident. We are made for one man and one wife. As the Old Testament said, nothing is better than to enjoy the wife of your youth for the whole of your life. So the next one, of course, give away things, limit your own experience in some areas, make sure you marry for love and not for sex. And then she goes on and says, you need to practice natural family planning. And she said, I know what you'll all say. That's just the same as contraception. The talk is called contraception, why not? And she said, in that case, why don't you do it? And of course, everybody's trapped by that one. But the truth of the matter is, in terms of technically effectiveness, natural family planning, especially in its most modern reincarnations, is more effective than condoms. And even the pill fails. You neglect to take it or whatever, especially if you're going on a burn, so to speak. No, that's not a good idea. So she says, I know what will happen. You know that in a few months or weeks even after your marriage, some of the bloom will go off the rose. You'll have your first serious argument, etc., etc. And you might say to one another, we're not doing so well, are we? Let's take a break. let's see if we can find a nice hotel for not too much money on Expedia or whatever. So you go off for a weekend. Now, of course, you get there and probably the wife will say, you know what time of the month it is, don't you? And he'll say, how could we do that? Now, you see, one of the things that happens with natural family planning is the man has to get used to the fact that women go through cycles every month that he doesn't have to bother with. So he becomes a great deal more sensitive at that level. And then the conversation in Janet's mind goes something like this. You said we couldn't afford a baby. You said you didn't want a baby. Well, maybe I do want a baby. Well, I've had a raise. Maybe we could afford it. So you do, and you do. Natural family planning couples know exactly when they conceived, and they don't look back on it as a bad thing. Children do things to us. I mean, I love watching my grandchild generation who are sufficiently distant from me in age, but still come and talk to me, watch them do a much better job than I did. I didn't devote anywhere near the amount of time I wish I had to my children. I didn't really realize, didn't want to think about how much some things mattered to them and that I ought to put some time into that. I never went to sports. My father never came to watch me, but I didn't think anything of that because he'd only got a bicycle. He wasn't going to, on his one day off a week, he wasn't going to come riding, 10 miles to watch me play cricket. No, he'd got better things to do. I didn't have any problem with that. But that was a different world. Now it's one of the places where maybe you have to go a bit, if only to modify the overarching thing that happens when you live that way. To live for sports is to live for a very transient thing. And all these celebs, this strange phenomenon of celebrity. How could a magazine like the People magazine even be sold? I mean, every now and again I come across one in the pocket of an aircraft. I thumb through it. Why does anyone read this? Not going to be better at the end of it. It's invoking some sort of envy, I think, which is one of the worst sins. It's certainly forbidden in the Ten Commandments. So Janet Smith sets out some ways of living which do, in fact, lead to good outcomes. One of the sorts of talks I used to give pre-COVID would be an after-dinner talk. And sometimes I would give this as an after-dinner talk. When I first realized that what the problem with the pill was, the worst invention of the 20th century in some ways, separating sex and procreation was not a smart move. And when I became convinced of that and started talking to the evangelical doctors who were one of the main groups I talked to, I thought, well, this will be the end of my speaking career, but I didn't mind about that. It wasn't, of course. And if I'm giving an after-dinner talk and I see a young couple with children, with a child or a couple, I know they're going to come and talk to me afterwards to say thank you. Because normally, you see, physicians get used to the idea that you have to put delayed gratification. That applies to families as well. Well, no, it shouldn't. When God brings your spouse into your life, marry and have children, the world is such that you might wreck your career at one level, but you'll have a different sort of career which uses your talents in ways that you could not have imagined. And it's deeply satisfying. I mean, now there's support groups for women who sacrifice their fertility, their career, and then find in their 40s that they desperately want a child. Well, there's nothing that can be done except to find people who are supportive as they're able to be. They capture you, those little beasts, don't they? Children have no idea how much power they have. I mean, a newborn baby can get you out of bed and down to the emerge at will, if they want, if they're in the mood, so to speak. They want to be the center of attention, whatever. You're going to worry about it. They've got you. And you don't actually mind. As time goes by, of course, grandchildren coming to see us and talk about life is one of the regular and most satisfying bits of my life. So, the modern world of technique is not serving us well. One of the people who's helped me to deal with that more effectively than I would do without him is Tom Sowell, who I mention frequently. Because he's understood these things very well from a purely public health, statistical, mathematical point of view. At least he doesn't show his underlying motivations. He's very coy about that. But he's black, and he is appalled at what has happened to the black family and the lies that have been told by those who make public policy, or if they're not lies, they demonstrate an ignorance which ought to preclude them from moving into that area. And they're vindictive too. Tom Sowell knows perfectly well, as do many thoughtful black scholars, that the family needs a lot more support. I think Denzel Washington said it beautifully not long ago, and Morgan Freeman, that's right, would say the same. But Denzel Washington stopped a liberal interviewer in her tracks when he said, well, you know what happens when there isn't a father in the home. Boys need males in their life, so if they don't have a father, where are they going to go looking for that father? On the street. And we all know what that means, don't we? He knows perfectly well that absentee fathers are a major cause of social pathology, if not the major cause. And Tom Sowell, of course, always looks at the data. So he's written quite a bit about this in various places, most of which is very uncomfortable for the liberals who don't bother with looking for counter evidence to their desired narrative. He points out, he goes, his first thing is, okay, you're changing public norms, moral norms. You ought to look at what it was like beforehand more seriously than you do, and you ought to think more carefully about what might happen. And then you should show me some studies before you move. And of course, those 3 points are not followed. But he did it himself, of course. Now, here's some figures that might interest you. Of course, the problems of the black family today have to be entirely due to racism. Well, he dealt with that quite a while ago, and of course they pretend it hasn't been dealt with. But he demonstrated that racism is not the cause. Centuries of slavery and generations of Jim Crow did not destroy the two-parent family. It was still the norm. Obviously, slave owners wanted baby slaves too. The way they tell the narrative doesn't even reach self-interest. But he said, here's what Tom Sowell says. Within one generation of the end of slavery, blacks had a higher marriage rate than whites. It wasn't much, it wasn't marginal, but it was the same. The black family didn't start to fall apart until much later. Here's some more data along those lines. He showed many times, not just for blacks, but for all sorts of groups, social capital is much more important than wealth in monetary terms. So, for instance, all the great pianos in the world, for a long while, were built by Jews. That was social capital. They did that because they had They developed the talents to do it. And you can go through and see all sorts of cultures that have developed certain skills. Where do the best carpets come from? That's something the Muslim world can do. And so you go on. He says in the 1890s, no, this is not Tom Sowell, I've forgotten who it is. I've just got it written down. There was one black high school and several white high schools in a particular part of Washington, D.C. And in the 1890s, the black school, M Street, Dunbar, frequently won the competition that arose out of standardized testing. They were the best high school. As late as 1910, 72% of males and 81% of women had been married, black, that is, in black society. It was not torn apart by all the horrors that happened to them. I guess in some ways those horrors made the family even stronger because it was the only place where you really felt safe. The turning point was quite late. I mean, as late as 1910, 72% of males and 81% of males in the black community were married. So marriage didn't fall apart when it was supposed to have done. The turning point is really the 1960s. That's when things really fell apart. Before the 1960s, unemployment for 16 and 17-year-old blacks was less than 10%. Since the 1960s, it's never been less than 20%. That's not an insignificant difference. Tom Sowell goes on, one of his turning points in his own life was the recognition that minimum wage is actually a social disaster, particularly for black youth. I've said this before, but I don't hear it repeated in society at large, so I'm going to go on saying it until it trickles into the general understanding of the world. Once you introduce a minimum wage, you really damage teenagers. You see, when you're a teenager and living at home, especially if you have no spare cash in the system, which was true of my upbringing, we were poor. I never had any pocket money. I got gifts at Christmas and I did odd jobs. But in those days, if a working class kid wanted to earn some money for a project, he could go around and look where he could find a job and then negotiate with the guy. Say, well, I need a job because I want to do X or Y. And there was community solidarity. The guy would say, okay, how much is that going to cost? And he said, okay, you come work for me for 3 weeks in harvest time or haymaking or whatever, and I give you that money. Now, that's well below minimum wage. So once minimum wage came in, that kind of charity couldn't be afforded. So sort of entry-level jobs on the short term for teenagers living at home, which made them think about, okay, how do I get this and that? They disappeared. So people without something to do are dangerous, especially boys. See, that paid for my bike. That paid for my trips. Every summer from 12 onwards, I would go on a long cycle trip. I mean, the longest was Vienna and back. And that was paid for by helping on a farm. Tom Sowell found that all out when he got a summer job funded by the government with the Minister of Labour. And when they got this bright kid, they didn't know what to do with him. They said, well, the most important thing we do in the Ministry of Labour is to run the minimum wage law, make sure it's applied. But we don't have any data. You go and find the data. What he found was the data showing that it didn't work. They were not happy. They suppressed it. So what happened in the 1960s? I mean, teenage pregnancy was dropping after the Second World War had finished. Crime was dropping. Murder was dropping. And then it all started to go the wrong direction in the 1960s. Now, I was at university in the 1960s. I went to university in 1958. So I've watched this process without understanding for a while, except I did recognize something important when the guy who invented the contraceptive pill gave the Reese lectures one year, and I happened to listen to them, and he said, it's wonderful to separate the pleasures of sex from the risk of reproduction. What God hath put together, let no man put asunder. That's wisdom from a long distant past. And of course, that's what happened. Now, the more cynical youth, if they having randomized sex at parties and the like and get a girl pregnant, they blame her. She should be taking the pill. You get middle-class mothers who put their girls on the pill so that they don't get pregnant. The ones who get pregnant are often good girls, especially they have to be careful now when they can be surreptitiously drugged and wake up in bed not knowing who they've slept with. Our world is out of control, and the pill plays a large role in it. And of course, the other thing other dots that don't want to be connected by the liberal elite is what's happened to sexually transmitted disease in my lifetime. When I took finals, if I knew 4 sexually transmitted diseases reasonably well, I wouldn't fail on that issue. Now, you need 40, so to speak. If there's a line of work in medicine that will never be unemployed in the foreseeable future, it's the treatment of sexually transmitted infections. They've gone through the roof. Why? You can connect those dots, surely. Now, what about the next bit? Poverty. Well, every census from the 1890s to the 1950s showed that blacks were better than whites in terms of employment. It wasn't much. Not statistically different would be the common thing. After 1960, that falls apart. Again, before 1960, 76% of women were married when they had their first child. Now, in the black community, teenage parents are the norm, and it's not a stable environment. One can make the case, and I think very aptly, that the Johnson public policies were cynical and intended to make a whole subset of society dependent upon the government. And they would be pointed out that it was the money that they lived by, their entitlements, came from the Democrats. Therefore, once we've got 50% dependent on us, we can win every election. Well, they haven't. The entitlement programs have created havoc. 2005, blacks, who are 13% of the population, constitute 49% of the murder victims. Most of the murders are black on black, 90%. Go listen to Denzel Washington and Morgan Freeman. Don't take this from me, and Tom Sowell. It can be changed. The charter schools are changing it. We shouldn't be ashamed of that. Tom Sowell has written a book on charter schools. He loves them because they set up wonderful experimental situations. In some of the charter schools in New York, run in the same building as the public school. The public school's budget is well over double what the charter schools spend on their children. But the charter school children are light years ahead of the rest. They're motivated in various ways. Black people are not stupid. They know perfectly well that education matters. They care about education far more than we do. Unfortunately, we're losing our understanding of what education actually looks like. But that's a whole other discussion. These issues need to be talked about. Now, I talked a little while ago about uh, Jonathan Haidt. And it's good to see that this is turning into a tsunami of change. His argument in The Anxious Generation that the iPhone is the major cause of social disruption, and that his argument is that no child should have access to one without very strict supervision. And in fact, the best thing would be not to have your hands on one until you're at least 16, when you've got some degree of self-control. Not enough. I mean, boys in particular, they don't get that kind of self-control until their mid-20s in many cases. Some bits of our brain are slow to develop. But Jonathan Haidt's recent contributions on Substack, pointing out examples he's getting. A lovely one, a teacher said, after COVID in particular, it was so bad. The kids sat there in class with their iPhones on, and I couldn't get to them. Recently, we have made them lock them up as they enter the school, and I've got my class back. I was thinking I couldn't do another 10 years of this, and now the joy of teaching has returned. When we go out to dinner and watch families where everybody's got their phone out, the kids in particular, and they're out for a meal, which should be a time when lots of things come out with a good meal in the conversation. Getting rid of the iPhone and its addictive properties is happening, and it's spreading rapidly throughout the Western world. That's going to be good news. It can only be good news. The guy who does all the work to make this podcast happen, the guy who started it, Craig, he has a son who reads a lot. I used to read a lot. Most kids read a lot. And we could get back to that. Always got his head in a book. That was a good idea. That was me. And I'm very grateful that we didn't have a television even. And we didn't have a television in our family either until the youngest was 15, and somebody gave us one, which was only watched for baseball by Jonathan and the news by Sally. Perfectly good television, hardly used. That's the way it should be. There are occasions when it would really be worthwhile. Now I want to put in another little footnote here about the society that we've cut off the metaphysical top, if you like. We don't know how to talk about the good life, whereas the Greeks' ethics said everybody wants to know. No, they don't in our society. Curiosity is not encouraged. Now we want to be on the phone, finding out what everybody else is doing about the most trivial nonsense. Cutting out the iPhones is going to help the West. They ought to cut it out in the Muslim world too, because Islam's power over Muslim believers who are often reciting prayers in a language they don't understand depended upon the fact that they had no other source of information except the Quran and the Imam. The arrival of the internet and the phone is destroying that. Now they're being shown, they can see on their phones how the rest of the world lives. And the women in particular don't like it, neither do the men actually. So Iran has a major problem. The data I've seen, and I don't know how good it is because I don't have any means to look at the data in that way, but it purports to show that over 50% of the population in Iran doesn't want to be bothered with Islam anymore. They're closing mosques. They are increasingly flaunting the rule of the Ayatollahs. Their days are numbered. You can't have enough people, if everybody moves in that direction, even if just a very large percentage moves, you have a problem. Chinese kids are saying it's not worth working in the environment you've produced. And so Xi has a problem with his workforce, combined with his demographic problem. there's going to be real problems. You can't get over a demographic gap in less than 20 years. The one-child policy can't be corrected in a year of allowing them to have children, especially if they no longer want them because they don't see a future. Another thing that destroys the future is reliance on easy income. The Dutch disease, it's called, which is interesting. They're not too bad a case, but when they discovered a huge amount of natural gas under parts of Holland, it undermined the way the Dutch could do everything within Holland because they could live on oil money, and so they had to start importing things which previously they made themselves. That happens in all sorts of areas. Wealth, not all good. Neil Ferguson, in his book on civilization, has a whole section discussing why North America became the productivity capital of the world, and South America under the Spanish didn't. And he argues, and I think very convincingly, that what the Spanish found in Peru was mountains of gold and silver, and so they shipped the silver back, even more silver, back to Spain, and they could buy everything they wanted. And they've never developed a self-sufficient culture since. America, indentured servants arrived from the poverty-stricken West, Ireland and England, and worked for 5 years as an indentured servant, then got some land. They worked hard for what they got. It didn't come easily. That was a gift. Read about it. These cycles of wealth, they're dangerous. Norway hardly has anyone going to church now. They're self-sufficient, with the emphasis on the self. They're not, of course, but they're being wiser than others because they have a good cultural background to work with. When people say we should take the money from the wealthy, they don't even look at the data again. Again, as Tom Sowell points out, you should look at the data that's easily available to you. People who are wealthy now were not wealthy earlier, and people who are wealthy earlier are not wealthy now in many, many cases. The Brits had a phrase, they say 3 generations from the gutter to wealth and back again, in another 3. Because once you become self-indulgent and you lose that capacity for disciplined hard work, the future is not good. But to have disciplined hard work when there's no future, that's why Paul's always talking about the hope that you have. Colossians is full of it. It's that hope for what is to be. We know that the answers aren't here. And of course, suffering is the best example of why there has to be more. You can't come up with any evolutionary benefit of suffering because there is no explanation for it, for much of it, unless it is teleological. It has a purpose, which is what Romans 8 argues, really, that God is at work in you to do his good pleasure. Read Tom Wright's book, which I got in my hand this week, After You Believe. I think it's a title. I haven't even got the title. I read that. I bought it for my son's birthday, and I couldn't resist reading a good chunk of it. And I'm half inclined not to give it to him, but I will. But he's dealing there. Romans 8 is about life as it should be lived. I'm looking forward to learning a lot more, but it's helped me before reading Tom Wright. When Martin Lloyd-Jones indicated that we don't read it properly. You can say, if the Spirit puts to death the deeds of the flesh, you will live, and in many churches nobody will bat an eyelid. What it actually says, if you, by the Spirit, put to death the deeds of the flesh, you will live. That's a narrative that you can live by. I hope you have a good week, and I hope to see you next week.